Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I apologize. We were having some technical difficulties getting set up here today, but we are up and running on Facebook Live and Instagram Live as well. And want to give folks a few seconds to sign on and log in and join us for today's discussion on race, race, justice, and equity. And it is a very timely topic that we're looking to have a healthy discussion with not just my agency, but also with all of you who are joining us from the general public, and really want to have an opportunity to engage in a healthy discussion that leads towards some very positive outcomes as well as solutions, and our ability to really drive forward some change in the communities that we all work, live, and play in. As we know, over the last couple of weeks and months, and actually years, we have had challenges with racial tension and social injustice and inequity as it relates to how certain communities, particularly the African American community, is marginalized but also underrepresented on a lot of equitable outcomes. And we really, I think, now have the opportunity to start the conversation, but allow that conversation to not just be talk, but really use that conversation and that talk to turn into tactics and strategies and things that we have an opportunity to change. And I think all of us own a part in that responsibility. And we're looking forward to today's discussion. Of course, we are really stepping out there and being bold as leaders in this space. I want to also share a couple things relative to just some disclaimers, and give me an opportunity to print out my talking points, because I do not want to be ill prepared for today, and I really want to try and organize a couple things I want to share before we get started, and really hope that you all would engage in a conversation with us. So my assistant is working as well on this presentation, if you will, or conversation, if you will, and is recording or taking your feedback and your questions, as well as looking forward to engaging with you. And I will definitely try to respond to and answer as many of your questions as I can, but welcome your interaction and welcome your feedback as well. Just a couple of things that I want to start out with from an expectation perspective, or at least to set the groundwork. First, no one is an expert on race relations. No one is an expert on this content or subject matter, because if they were, or if we were, we wouldn't be having this discussion today, or the country, the world would not be in the state that it's in. So with that disclaimer, I just encourage us and implore us to approach this from a level of ignorance that we all share, that we all have, relative to trying to figure out what works, trying to figure out what's right as we move forward as individuals, as a community, as a country, as a nation, as the world. We're all struggling with the topic around race and justice and equity. And just so that we are clear that there are no experts, individuals have expertise based upon their experience or their learning in this area. But again, my disclaimer is I am not an expert. I do not know everything. I am here because I want to share, but I also want to learn, because that is why we're here. We all have, and I've learned recently, differing ways of viewing and differing ways of how we understand what is going on in the country right now, or going on as it relates to race, justice, and equity. So we put our lens, or we bring our bias, and we all have biases that we bring, and we bring our lens based upon our experiences. And with our experiences, that impacts how we make decisions, and that impacts what we do as we interact with other people. The other part of what I wanted to share from a disclaimer is that this is intended to be positive, not to offend anyone, not to hurt anybody's feelings. But if it does create some awareness for you, and that awareness makes you or I uncomfortable, that's okay. Because what that uncomfortability means is that there's an opportunity for us to change. But with that, I would ask that we would be willing to hear, willing to listen, willing to learn, but also willing to take an action item from this discussion today to ensure that what we do, how we do it, allows us to move forward as a community and as a team, if you will, to get the best outcomes that are needed to heal our country and to heal and address this issue. So with that, just want to definitively talk about these topics or these content areas. The first is race. And as we look at race, unfortunately and fortunately, race is something that society uses to define us. As a spiritual person and a God-fearing man, I can't help but to say that God created all of us in his image, and he created all of us equally. And he did not lay out race or different characteristics that the world uses to define us, but the reality is the world does this. So in how we interact and in how we address one another, unfortunately, but yet fortunately, we use these categories to determine how we identify different things and different characteristics and traits about us. Race is one of them. The definition of race is a class or kind of people unified by shared interest, habits, or characteristics. So when we talk about race, it is really to make those unique characteristics about us unique. And we should not use them as a tool to define things like how we provide care or how we interact or how we identify individuals. But unfortunately, as I said, that's one of the tools that we often use to do that. And with race, that is normally what causes the inequity that we'll talk about today as well. Second definition I just wanted to share, just to level set, is justice. Justice is the quality of being just, impartial, or fair. And I believe that that is the linchpin for why we are having this discussion today. Because through a lot of things that have happened recently and in past times, justice has not been equitable. And the outcomes have been disproportionate as it relates to the African American community and other marginalized groups of individuals that are either defined by race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, and other determinants that we use to classify people. The third definition is equity, which is what I'm hoping that can be the outcome of today's discussion as we collaborate and really become transparent and vulnerable to the issues of today and say, what can I do as an individual, or what can I do within my role that I function in, or what can I use my community capacity to do, or what can I use my privilege to do to drive towards equity? Because again, if God created us all as human beings, then we should not use certain determinants to identify what is equitable, what is fair, and what is just for individuals. But equity, by definition, is justice according to natural law or right, specifically freedom from bias or favoritism. So as we look at equity, we want to make sure that we level the playing field for those who have been marginalized over time. And with that, playing our role in ensuring that no matter what my privileges are, and we all have them, there's black privilege, there's white privilege, there's Latino privilege, there's privilege that we all possess as a culture or as a race. But as we define what that is so that there are equitable outcomes for all, we want to look at that from having freedom from bias or favoritism, but ensuring that we remove what we deem to be our advantage in that. And when we look at our inequities, normally it's stemmed by our desire to have an advantage over another group or another people or another person. So as we move forward, and if we're honest about where we are, let's look to remove those privileges that we tend to advantages that we tend to try and hold on to, that normally creates this inequity or disparity for targeted groups. We are not, I believe, looking for a state of equality, but more or less a state of equity, because it's very difficult to desire to be equal. We may not be equal. We all live and play in different communities. We all live and play in different socioeconomic statuses. We all live and play in diverse communities and groups, and where our background and experience or level of education separate us, and that's okay. But as it relates to the things that are important for us to live and survive and to thrive and to grow, we all, I believe, need to seek equity. And in that, I think that we all own a responsibility or have a level of accountability around ensuring that the same things that are important to me are important to those who don't have the same resources that I have, to ensure that we get equitable outcomes. Health, life, welfare, well-being, all of those things that are important, we should be able to ensure that all of our community, and that is the human community, and not just people who look like me, not just people who don't look like me, but all people, as it relates to God's plan for the world, that all of us are created in his image, and there should not be any difference on how we treat gay people or how we treat black people or how we treat marginalized individuals or those who don't have what we have. It should be desired that everyone have equitable outcomes. And with that, we can't help but to focus on the current racial climate. Since 2015, there have been over 5,400 police-involved killings, and a large number of those have been in the African American community. And one of the areas I think we should use to have a very transparent but real discussion is, why does that anger the African American community, and why is that important to the African American community? We've heard a lot of discussion around Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, and as I said in a previous video, but since we're having this Facebook Live discussion and Instagram Live discussion today, let me be clear that as an African American male who is the CEO of a behavioral mental health and substance use disorder treatment facility, I am a target for a lot of controversy, and as it relates to this particular topic around policing and police murders, when I say Black Lives Matter, it is not a dismissal of All Lives Matter. We all know that all lives matter, but all lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter. Because if we are a part of all, then how can you dismiss where we bring our experience when we make the statement that Black Lives Matter? Or if I make the statement that my life matters. And I, as an individual, or I as a father, or I as a husband, or I as your friend, your peer, your colleague, your coworker, your loved one, someone that you care about, if it were me under the knee of a police officer and you were standing there watching and I said Black Lives Matter or I can't breathe, would it hit you differently because you know me? And would you have a different response if I made that statement to you, other than thinking that I am dismissing All Lives Matter because of my personal situation? Let's take that a step further. So as a group, when our culture or our race or our ethnic group brings these things to bear, it is with that intent to create a level of awareness, to absolve ignorance, and to also create the platform for you who are not connected to that situation to be able to respond with, well, what can I do to help? Because again, if that were me in that situation that George Floyd was in, would you have or would you respond differently? When we talk about the statistics of, 5,400 people shot and killed by police, and it's not people from your community, does it make a difference? Does it have an impact? Are you taking the opportunity to replace those names with your names of your loved ones or people that you might care about, to make it more personal, so that then when you're challenged or charged to do better or to do different, you're not going back to an isolated community and saying, wow, look at what's happening to them, but more or less looking at it from the perspective of look at what's happening to us, and what can I do with whatever my capacity is to make a change in that area. I did want to take an opportunity to also say their names, because there are, again, this is a microcosm of the list of people who have been either killed by police activities and or by racist acts that are from the African American community. And we will post a link to the article that shares this information. But I wanted to take an opportunity to acknowledge those who have been killed by police acts and or racist acts over the years, that we really need to look at, as this list, as short as it is, does not reflect the comprehensive list, but it should be at a point where, what are we going to do going forward to make sure that we stop adding names to this list? That list starts with Trayvon Martin. When Trayvon Martin was killed back in about 7 years ago, that is what launched the Black Lives Matter movement. And because of his death, and you can look at the details of his death, David, if you can post the link to that article that I shared with the collage, if we can look at the details of how each of these individuals died and make it personal, I think that it can create a level of sensitivity that leads to measurable and sustainable change. But Trayvon Martin, and please forgive me if I mispronounce any of these names, but Tatiana Jefferson, Jonathan Farrell, Jordan Edwards, Stephon Clark, Amadou Diallo, Renisha McBride, Tamir Rice, Sean Bell, Walter Scott, Philando Castillo, Iana Jones, Terrence Crutcher, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Jordan Davis, Sandra Bland, Botham Jean, Oscar Grant, Corey Jones, Eric Gardner, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Maurice Gordon, Breonna Taylor, Rashard Brooks, Robert L. Fuller, and Malcolm Hirsch. These were just a short list of the many who were listed in this particular article, but these are lives. These are people that are connected to other people, that are family members or fathers or children or loved ones that belong to someone. And irrespective of how they got on this list, it should, if it did not, impact all of us around how do we prevent this list from growing? What can we do to make a change? And when we talk about it from an African American perspective, it's unfortunate that since our coming to this country as slaves and as a group of people, we were never viewed as a full person. And if you know your African American history, we were always viewed as property, or 3/5 of a person, until the law and the Constitution and legislation gave us an opportunity through the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth and other declarations that we were then on paper supposedly viewed as equals. But over the last 400 plus years or so, we have not been viewed equitably. And if we were, some of these names that were read today for you, we would have not had their names on our list, because even in policing and police activities, we notice the inequity of how African Americans have been policed versus a young man that may have gone into a church for a Bible study and sat there with the parishioners, went through a worship experience, and then shot and killed a number of individuals, and then how he was arrested versus how George Floyd was arrested through the policing process. There's inequity. Don't want to get into a lot of details about that, but I think that, again, there are opportunities for us as individuals and as advocates for change to really allow this to hit home and to want to create and or do something different as we move forward. Whether you're white, black, Asian, Latino, and or otherwise, whatever race, ethnicity, or culture, gender, sexual orientation that you are, I'm praying that this is hitting home for you to say this has to stop. We have to listen to the voices of those who are being hurt and harmed by what's going on and do our part to try to create measurable and sustainable change. Some of the things that I'll share as I get ready to open this up to discussion are some best practice opportunities I think that we have. Understanding that this is a very sensitive and a very tough topic to discuss, I think one of the best practices that we all can engage in and take a part in is, one, create a platform for the discussion. A lot of times it is deemed as not politically correct or PC to have a discussion, or not knowing what questions to ask, or being viewed as racist because if you ask this question, how are you going to be viewed, when you honestly just want to know? And, you know, whether it is my white counterparts or other people that just have a level of ignorance that you're looking to get resolved for, have the question. I would also, you know, encourage us to not just ask the question or have the conversation, not have the question, but have the discussion. Start at home. Have those discussions with your families. Have those discussions within your circle of influence or your network or sphere of influence to be able to, again, identify where there might be some gaps and or areas where you can learn, but also share. Because, again, we are all creatures of our comfort zone, and we bring bias into everything that we do, but use that bias to create best practices and best outcomes when you're having these discussions in your home, in your community, on your job, and with the leaders of your organizations. And I challenge every leader out there to create a platform to have that discussion with your leadership and with your agency and with those whom you are doing business with, because it's important, because you may be hurting someone by how you operate because you don't have the capacity to be transparent or vulnerable, or don't want to have that capacity and to drive change. I am, in my leadership style, from my interactions with my board to the people that I employ, are very transparent with having this discussion. Hence why we're having this discussion today. This started out as an internal opportunity, but I wanted to, you know, be bold and step out there and have a public discussion without the fear of career suicide and without the fear of feeling like I have to hide behind this issue that is impacting us all because I want to be politically correct. But I am trusting God that, you know, no matter the outcome of this conversation, if we can make one mark towards a sustainable change, then my work here is done, and I'll let God deal with the consequences. But with that challenge, I also challenge agencies, organizations, and leaders to look at your policies as a best practice. Look at all of your policies that you have within your agency to see how inclusive they are, and take two approaches as you look at those policies. Ask the question, does this policy help someone, or how does this policy help all people, or how does this policy hurt anyone, as your second measuring tool against your policies. As you look at that, be transparent and open to modifying your policies if those policies don't support inclusion and equity and have the ability to drive your organization forward by how you address those two questions. And that is from your board level to your agency level. And in that review, you can drive some measurable and strategic change. And that's what's important as we go forward, because ultimately, if you are doing things as an organization or as a leader or as a team that impact people disproportionately, then why are you doing it? And we are all guilty of some form of that. But I'm imploring, I am encouraging, and I am challenging all of us as leaders in organizations. But I am putting my CEO activities and strategies on the line here to say that the Crossroads Center is committed to doing the same. We recently looked at our policies and at a board level and are going through some revisions, but we're also looking at being transparent and sharing data around our diversity and ensuring that, again, although we may meet certain metrics from a diversity perspective, but how are we continuing to review, evaluate, and ensure that as we look to mirror and reflect the community that we serve, what are our strategies, tactics, and resources that are going to go into ensuring that we do that effectively, and that what we do is not just checking the box, but that it is measurable and sustainable. Thirdly, I would say, relative to a best practice, we should look at legislative change. And all of us have an opportunity to make changes legislatively. I think as individuals, we should vote with our voice, and we have to not have our voices muted when we speak up about certain issues like race or policing and or other things that are impacting our community in a specific or a way that creates disproportionate outcomes. So with that, vote with your voice, but we need to vote. We need to show up. We need to understand what the issues are, and we need to articulate those issues without the fear of having our voices muted. We also vote with our pockets, or we protest with our pockets. Whenever there are inequitable things like the Starbucks situation, which I won't get into here, but where groups are marginalized or policies are not consistent in these organizations that we support financially, protest with your pocket and be very adamant about that, because your dollar counts. And that is the same thing for our agency. Where we do business or who we do business with shall be structured around how common we come together to ensure that injustice is not implied on a particular group or it marginalizes people. And I'm holding my team accountable within the organization around supplier diversity, as well as looking at the practices of some of these major firms when it comes to how they treat either the African American community or other interest groups that create an alienation of them. And if they do that, then we cannot work with, partner, or support them financially. But vote with your voice and protest with your pocket. And then I will also say that use your leverage to create some inclusive change. I am a part of a group called the Ohio Alliance for Recovery Providers. And in our statewide meeting that we had a few weeks ago, we brought this up as an agenda topic. And out of that agenda topic, we were able to craft a unified letter and statement on what we are doing as agencies in response to the racial tension that is going on, the impact that that is having in our communities, and what we can do collectively to create some legislative change. And that letter has been adopted by a number of agencies, approximately 40 agencies around the state. And we're going to also share that with other organizations outside of our industry as a best practice tool. But that then will be shared with some of our state officiating agencies and their leaders to ensure that our voice is heard and that they are aware of our approach that we're taking as a collective, but also as individual organizations. I cannot, within my right, sit back as the CEO of an organization that touches these marginalized populations and not say what's right or do what's right. And if I don't use my role as an opportunity to drive and impact change, then I don't need to be in the role. And I challenge each of our CEOs, whether it is from a major corporation to a minor nonprofit or storefront, if you are a leader, I implore you to do what's right with this issue. I implore you to take what we've talked about on this Facebook Live and Instagram Live discussion today to another level. And even if you're not in an organization or an agency, but you are an individual, again, as we look at and replay that video of George Floyd's death in on YouTube and whatever social media outlet that you viewed it, and if you haven't, go view it. But as you watch it, irrespective of what led to that interaction with the police, no human being deserves to be treated as he were. And if you put yourself in that situation, or someone that you love in that situation, take George Floyd out of it, but put your neck under the knee of that individual police officer who committed the crime of murder of this human being. And it's unfortunate that had that been a dog, had that been an animal rights people would have been all over this. And there's more care for animals than there is for human life in our country. And we really need to calibrate to, as individuals, take the responsibility to say, if that happened to a human, then that should not happen again. And what can we do to drive change? With that, I just pray that this message or these talking points have been a blessing to you, that it has also made some of us uncomfortable, because that uncomfortable space is good. And if you are uncomfortable and feel comfortable with sharing some comments here, I'll try to address your comments and or engage you in a discussion. I will also avail myself to having an offline discussion with anyone who wishes to really understand where we are as a community, as African Americans. Let me say, I am not the spokesperson for the African American community. I am the spokesperson for Jamahal C. Boyd Sr. But I believe that my collective or my individual voice fits into a collective discussion that we need to have. And if anyone has a level of ignorance that they're wishing to resolve, by all means, let's do that. And I avail myself for that conversation online or offline with anyone to drive sustainable and measurable change. As I close, I will say that what we need to do from here is have a discussion that leads to an agenda, that leads to an organized agenda around what we can do next together to ensure that these types of crimes and incidents don't occur going forward. But what can we really do to drive measurable and sustainable change? Thank you. We have a question here. It says, can you give some guidance on how the white community can have these conversations? Yes, absolutely. And again, I don't want to use race or color as a barrier to having a conversation. I think that's a great question. I think all of us, whether you're white, black, Jewish, Indian, Asian, we need to have a conversation on how this racial tension hits us. Start with having those conversations in your home. Talk to your family, talk to your spouses, talk to your children, talk to your loved ones, your significant others, to really start a larger conversation. And I think that when you can do that as an individual, irrespective of what color you are, what race you are, it should create a sense of awareness of, here's my level of understanding, but here's what I don't know. And again, as I started out, none of us are experts in this area, but as long as we have a willingness to learn what we don't know and do something with what we don't know, it creates opportunity for change. And I believe that whether you're white, black, or otherwise, and all of us have diverse friends, you should, in those friendly networks, try to establish a meaningful conversation. I have had some of my white friends and counterparts just come to me and really say, I don't know what to ask. I don't know what to say, but I want to learn. And I think that was so powerful for me, simply because acknowledging that there is an ignorance and that there is an unwillingness to be viewed as racist because you have questions, and then to be able to, on both parts, engage in a discussion that does not become confrontational, but just, if there is a question about certain things, be able to bring that to bear in that discussion to be able to, again, drive sustainable and some measurable change. I would also say in having those conversations, try to identify what an outcome is so that you get to a goal and you're not just having a conversation just to talk, but you may be talking to develop tactics and using those tactics to develop strategies and change that leads to some community change. James Wilson says, what steps would you offer to create a safe, judgment-free environment for these authentic conversations to happen? I would recommend, James, thank you for your question, really setting the foundation with a genuine foundation. And by that I mean, you can tell if somebody's genuine or not. And by that, I would encourage you to look at what a lot of these organizations have been doing after the looting and rioting were going on, because it was a lot of not genuine acts being done in protection of revenue, protection of resources, etc., but not really doing things like we're doing here today, James, to create that platform. And I think where you lay that genuine groundwork is to come organized to a discussion like that as you engage other people and say, here's where I am in terms of my bias, my privilege, my inability to do what's right going forward, and I want to learn. And here's what I believe those outcomes could be as I learn from you, but as you also learn and hear from me about why I think the way that I think. If I grew up in a different neighborhood that was isolated and I only saw people who look like me, of course, as I interact and engage with other people who don't, I'm not going to know certain things. So I'm looking to you to help me identify ways to drive forward and ways to do better, differently, by using this conversation as a platform. And I hope that that answers your question, James. James also said, I think it's important for people to understand that while they may not have personally subscribed to a racist thought, but participate in a system, in racist systems. I mean, again, I want to be clear and to say that James and others, we are all impacted by racism. And whether or not we promote racism, we're all impacted by racism or have been a part of some type of racist conversation, act, or deed, or thought. And, you know, one of the things I've learned and have learned from mentors of all different cultures is that racism is taught. And, you know, God did not design us to be racist. But in our, again, closed communities, we are accustomed to certain things. I grew up in the projects in West Philadelphia, and you know, it was predominantly black. I don't know if there were, it was less than 1% white in my housing project. And with that, culturally, racially, ethnically, we used terms. We, you know, had a view on white people and others that were not in our community, that led to, you know, racist beliefs and or racist interactions. But as that was taught, and then as I went to college and moved out of the housing project, it led to a different level of awareness and a level of sensitivity, and being able to embrace those differences that gave me the opportunity to let go of some of those racist things that I were taught in my community. And again, we are all subject to that. And it is a challenge, but again, I believe that individually we have to be willing to let go of that and accept our ignorance and be able to want to do different and do better. Crystal says, what has been happening is racism is at its worst. It's ugly, demented, and vile. It also permeates every fiber of what the United States is made of and what it is built, and it is what built the foundation of this country. Yes, Crystal, I mean, I think that it is systemic, and we do have an opportunity to impact change. by some of these things that we've talked about as potential best practices here. But one of the things that we need to do is vote with our voice. We need to speak up, and we need to come together, again, organized and collective, white and black together, to ensure that we have an agenda that drives change. Unfortunately, we're in a country that leadership is absent of caring for resolving some of these racist and other acts that disproportionately impact people. And it's not creating unity from a leadership perspective, but it's creating more division if, again, our leaders that don't see this as an issue for them don't do what is appropriate in the roles that they're in to drive change. And I'm not calling out any one in particular, but I think you get my message. But as a subject to poor leadership in this area, we have to stand up and do what's right as a collective, because those leaders or that leader might be one or a number, but how we drive change is to drive them out. And if we're not able to drive them out, then now we have to deal with that type of leadership that divides versus unifies. Kathy Berlew says national data shows that blacks are less likely to enter treatment and more likely to leave prematurely. I believe one factor is that culturally tailored treatments are frequently not available. I think we have a real opportunity to address equity at the Crossroads Center by making sure our treatments are culturally appropriate. Absolutely. And that is one of the things, if you've noticed in my one of the things I've shared recently in one of our charges from the board or to the board as well, is that although we care for all people, we will be laser focused on ensuring that we improve awareness and access and treatment and engagement for those who are struggling with or impacted by substance use disorder, mental behavioral health issues at the Crossroads Center. That is one of our main focuses, and we're using census data. We're using other data elements to identify in our service footprint area and abroad, how do we go out and get people that we know are impacted by addiction and or mental behavioral health issues, and bring them in to the care that they need, and not focus highly or so highly on those who are impacted by the opioid crisis at this time, which is largely disproportionately reported because of the fact that there are so many stereotypes and stigmatisms in these African American and marginalized communities that prevent them from having the level of treatment that Kathy just brought up in the comment. So again, Kathy, thank you for your service in this area and your commitment and dedication. And I want to also thank my board for their dedication, commitment, and passion around us doing what we do globally, but focusing on what we do as a target for those who are in the African American community and population, and also those who are marginalized, underserved, and underrepresented. That is what our work is. And again, as the CEO of this organization, I say to my board, I say to our agency, I say to my leaders that that is our focus. That is our commitment. And we want to ensure that what we do is not going to exclude anyone, but improve those who have been excluded, and improve, the opportunities for those who have been excluded, to ensure that we drive towards equity. Are there other questions or comments that we can address? David, I'm not sure if you're able to, but if you can, in the comments, can you post that image of the individuals whose names I've read earlier today in the comments? And the intention for just sharing this image is to, again, make us sensitive to what others who may not look like you are going through. And it is an opportunity, if you're willing and open to, drive you to have a heightened sense of awareness and have a heightened sense of vulnerability and transparency around changing, because change is important and change is what's needed. And it is important that, again, we all leverage our privilege. And I appreciate all of my white friends that have come to me very transparently to have the discussion around what can I do, what can we do as a culture to change. I am also looking forward to a conversation with one of my friends who's actually a principal in our school district around educational equity to ensure that we create and establish things that don't hinder or minimize the voice of our children when they're trying to learn and or bringing their experiences to the classroom. So more to come on that, but I am doing everything that I can within my space and sphere to drive change. And you know, if it starts with a conversation, but that conversation leads to innovation, and that innovation leads to sustainable and measurable change, I think all of us have an opportunity to do that. Terry says, thank you, Jamahal, for sharing your perspective and modeling a great way to have an important conversation. Thank you, Terry. You know, again, this is what I believe is relevant and necessary. And as a leader, and a black leader at that, I believe that this is the right thing to do. And, you know, when we do the right things, then the right outcomes will occur. But you know, unfortunately, everybody doesn't process things the same, and everybody doesn't see these subject matter issues the same. So I thank you all for, you know, entertaining this discussion today, because I think that it's relevant and it's timely. And I hope and pray that this leads to other conversations. I know that it will within our organization from an accountability perspective, and we will be doing a lot around diversity and inclusion and equity training and education, and having discussions that really lead to change. So I know from my perspective, and even in my home, we are very adamant about ensuring that these conversations continue. Susan, thank you. Susan says, thank you very much for inviting me to this. This meeting was very informative, and it's important to listen and respect everyone. I totally thank you, and I'm humbled by your comment, Susan Willis. And yes, it is important for us to have these discussions with a listening ear, but also being able to share that it might drive change. And thank you for joining on, and I pray and trust that you will do as we suggested and pass along some of this these things that could spark the conversation, starting with in your home and within your community, within your church or synagogue or mosque or wherever you fellowship spiritually, and have the discussion in your community, your sphere of influence, those whom you run with, play with, and drink with, or hang out with. Have the discussion that it might drive change, and prayerfully that we can identify where we fall short to create opportunities that build bridges. And again, thank you, Crystal. My cousin is on here as well. Thank you she says, thank you for opening up the discussion. It's been my pleasure to do so. Any of my Crossroads team members that are on that might have questions, I welcome you to place them in the comments here so that we can address them. And or if you aren't comfortable with sharing, you know, my door is always open for us to have an in-agency discussion. I am, again, just humbled to have the platform to do this, and humbled to have the support of my board and my agency and my community to do what is risky and not popular, by having a discussion around race, justice, and equity. And, you know, I welcome all of my CEO counterparts within the city of Cincinnati to work with me, work with us to develop what we do next. I've reached out to Chief Isaac at the Cincinnati Police Department, and another Chief of Police, Tom Sinan, who does a lot of great work in the addiction area from out of Dayton, but also in the region. I've reached out to them. I've reached out to a number of the media outlets to come together around the platform, and again, it's not to promote any other agency or any area over another, but how do we come together as a community to collaborate to really identify not just the strategies that need to be carried forward, but the resources to sustain them, and have a plan for really how do we implement this to drive change. I offer the Crossroads Center as a safe haven and a safe space for us to come together as a community, and I invite all of us as leaders to figure out what our role is and what our part is in ensuring that this conversation turns into a larger conversation that leads to change. And again, not calling anybody on the carpet, but I'm calling everybody on the carpet. We all own a part in this, and if you're unwilling to play, then you're part of the problem. So again, I thank you for this humbling opportunity to have this discussion with you today. I pray that it's been a blessing, and I look forward to next steps and next solutions that lead to change as we go forward. Thank you all for tuning in on Instagram Live as well as on Facebook Live, and we will be sharing some information in the post after this is over of links to the articles that I referenced, as well as some of the images that we talked about today. And I pray that we can really change the world as we go about from here. Thank you all. Have a blessed and productive day on purpose.